We have two scripture readings this morning. The first from 2nd Isaiah. The Holy One gives strength to the weary and empowers the powerless. Young women may grow tired and weary. Young men may stumble and fall, but those who wait for the Holy One find a renewed power. They soar on eagle's wings. They run down and don't get weary. They walk and never tire. Second, from the 3rd chapter of Philippians. It is not that I have reached it yet or have already finished my course, but I'm running the race to grab hold of the prize if possible. Sisters and brothers, I don't think of myself as having reached the finish line. I give no thought to what lies behind, but I push on to what is ahead. Ancient words for our current understanding.
I'd like to reprise something that I said in the first service. It's on my heart and it needs saying. And that is, I really want to thank the staff for everything that they've done in the month of October to keep us moving forward steadily. We are blessed to have them. Thank you for all that you have done. Now, I'd like to begin this morning by telling you the story of a man who's not very well known in history. In most cases, I suspect he's only a footnote if you've heard his name at all. And if I'm honest with myself, through the years of studying him, he has changed the trajectory of my own life. And so we'll talk about him in just a second, but before we get there, I have to set the stage for you, and we have to go back in history to a time that is rather dark and depressing in terms of social justice, civil rights, civil liberties, a host of individual freedoms. And I'm speaking about the first half of the 20th century. And you may remember how we got to that point at the end of the Civil War with the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in 1865, 1868, and 1870. Then we had Reconstruction, and at the end of Reconstruction, we came to a period of serious retrenchment. As civil rights achieved as a result of the Civil War and the ratification of those amendments was undermined. What's not as well known is there was tremendous division during this period within the civil rights movement. On the one hand, we had accommodationists like Booker T. Washington, a name I suspect you remember. Mr. Washington, the educator, a business person, he was first the principal and then the president of Tuskegee. And in fact, in 1895, 1 year before Plessy versus Ferguson, and you remember Plessy, it created the doctrine of separate but equal and gave legal sanction to a segregated society. Listen to the words of Mr. Washington, for he said these in his Atlanta Exposition address in 1895, 1 year before Plessy. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand, things essential to mutual progress. Now you might imagine that made him quite popular with the white establishment. On the other hand, we had assimilationists like W.B. Du Bois, whose seminal work, published in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, lays out what assimilation is all about and introduces some other concepts that you will recognize from a much later period. If you remember critical race theory, the academic construct of the 1970s and 80s, which addresses the issue, are we talking about individual discrimination, or are we talking about systemic racism? Du Bois answers those questions in The Souls of Black Folk because he introduces the concept of double consciousness, which in simplest terms means people of color have individual self-concepts, but layered on top of those self-concepts, a second set assigned to them by the dominant white society, devastating to developing the individual psyche and totally destructive of personal growth. So we have these two competing versions of the civil rights movement. But the bottom line is nothing happened in civil rights between 1896 and 1954, save the 19th Amendment in 1920 giving the vote to women. But beyond that, we have a dark and bleak period in our history. Then in 1954, we come to Brown versus the Board of Education. How in the world did we get there? If you ask people, tell me the names that you associate with Brown, who's responsible for that wonderful decision? Most will say Chief Justice Earl Warren. He pushed the court hard to get them to that 9-0 decision in Brown. Some will say, what about Thurgood Marshall, who argued the case, helped prepare the case, brilliant in his oral arguments? But I'm going to argue with you this morning. In fact, I'm going to assert it without, I suspect you responding to this. I would credit someone entirely different with getting us to Brown and being responsible for it and changing the course of history in this country. And it's a name I suspect not many of you have heard, Charles Hamilton Houston. Now let me tell you a little bit about Charlie Houston. He was born in 1895, attended and graduated from Amherst. He was Phi Beta Kappa, valedictorian of his graduating class at Amherst. Served in World War I in France, and then coming home from the war, Harvard Law School. He was the first person of color to serve as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. And then after graduation, he joined his dad's law firm. Could have ended there. But in 1929, he was named as the dean of the Howard Law School. And it was there that he tutored such people as Thurgood Marshall, William Bryant, Oliver Hill, a host of civil rights attorneys. And then in 1935, what I think is a pivotal moment in the history of the civil rights movement, Houston was named by the NAACP as its first full-time paid counsel. And in that role, he developed a 4-point plan to end segregation in America. And it's an ingenious plan, beautifully crafted. If you know Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 decision, it's a public transportation decision. But Houston said to himself, I think better than public transportation, let's focus our attack in public education. It's more visible, it involves children, it reaches more people, and most importantly, it has the potential to change not only our minds, but our hearts. Because Houston believed that if you're really going to change the structure of society, you have to change underlying attitudes. And public education, he thought, was the best route to go. Second plank in his plan is for a constitutional argument. He decided, let's use the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Legal scholars subsequently have said that was the perfect choice given the situation. And so he picked constitutionally the best route to follow. Thirdly, and this is the most ingenious part to me, I find this just fascinating, he said to himself, well, we're stuck with Plessy for the time being. So what we need to do is to go out into these school systems, which are separate, and see if they are in fact equal, which is demanded by Plessy. And so he filed lawsuits all over the country addressing that very issue, because in terms of financial spending, it was 10-to-1 white schools to black schools. And in terms of teacher salaries, it was almost 2.5-to-1. So it was an easy battle in that sense. And it drove the white power structure nuts because they had to defend all these suits all over the country. Then finally, he decided if we're going to make this work, we've got to attack Plessy itself. Hence, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. Because in Topeka, the school systems were equal in terms of their funding, but they were unequal in absolutely everything else. And so the case made its way to the Supreme Court, argued orally there by Thurgood Marshall. Now, something helped Houston at this point that had been unanticipated. And there was a big argument among the legal scholars leading up to Brown as to whether or not to use this. And I'm speaking here of the doll studies conducted by sociologist Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie, who was a psychologist. And I'll just give you the first iteration of the study. I think you'll get the idea. What the Clarks did is they took two dolls, one white with blonde hair and one brown with black hair, and they showed these dolls to children ages 3 to 7, black children ages 3 to 7. And they would ask them a series of questions such as, hand me the doll that looks most like you. Hand me the doll that you think is the prettier. Hand me the doll that you think is successful. Hand me the doll that you would like to be like. And over again, vast majority of the black children selected the white doll. Now, if you ever want to understand systemic racism, or you want to understand double consciousness, you will never get a better example than the doll studies. By the way, those studies came under attack for some methodological issues, but replicated over and over again in the years that followed with precisely the same results. So the court then, moved by that, pushed hard by the Chief Justice, led to the decision by Charles Hamilton Houston, rendered the opinion that the wording of which is so familiar, yet I think worth repeating this morning. To separate children from others of similar age and qualification solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community, may affect their hearts and minds in a way never to be undone. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now, unfortunately for the court, despite the beautiful wording of that decision, they had an operational component in the decision, and it said we need to implement with all deliberate speed. And you remember the story here. In the South, the focus was on deliberate and not on speed. But nonetheless, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka sets up significant change in civil rights. And let me just remind you of some of the change that followed. Took a decade, but it happened. Even something as simple as food stamps in 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the court decision Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, which legalized birth control, because up to that point, all we had was the RISMA method. Medicare and Medicaid in 1965, Title IX in 1972, which outlawed discrimination on the basis of gender, and of course, Roe versus Wade in 1973. Now, in many ways, I think Charles Hamilton Houston got us not just Brown versus the Board of Education with that plan, but the precedent that it set for legislation and court decision that followed. Now back to Houston for just a minute. You might be surprised to learn that he died in 1950, 4 years before Brown. But I want you to listen to these prophetic words that he uttered in 1949, a year before his death. There are times when it's possible to forecast the results of a lawsuit before the final event has taken place. As far as the struggle for civil rights is concerned, that struggle in America is won. What I'm more concerned about is the fact that the Negro shall be content simply with demanding an equal share in the existing system. It seems to me that our historical challenge is to make sure that the system guarantees justice and freedom for everyone. Now, let me read that last sentence again because it changed my life. It seems to me that our historical challenge is to make sure that the system guarantees justice and freedom for everyone. Probably sounds familiar to you because it's part of the mission statement of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. So Houston gives us an overarching philosophy that isn't just driven by issue, but is driven by underachieved individual attitudes, that if we're going to change society in a meaningful way, we have to change underlying attitudes that lead to behavior. So if we were living in 1967, we might be very happy about where we were in terms of the progression of civil rights. But here we are in 2023. Hence the title of this message, Welcome to 1950, because that's where we find ourselves once again. Roe versus Wade, gone. Griswold versus Connecticut, under attack viciously by Clarence Thomas. Individual freedoms at the state level, undone. I mean, look at what we've done in Texas and what's happened in Florida and across the South and the upper Midwest. It's unbelievable the retrenchment that has taken place in terms of civil rights. And in some ways, we're in even worse shape than we were in 1950, because think of the Supreme Court. In most of its history, until maybe 15 years ago, justices rose to the occasion. Whether they tended toward strict construction or loose construction, they saw the Constitution as a living document that had to adapt to the times in which we find ourselves. If you want a perfect example of that, you need go no further than Earl Warren, because think of him as the Attorney General and Governor of California. During World War II, he presided over the worst violation of civil liberties in this country that I can think of, and that is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, something for which he deeply regretted in his memoirs written years later. So we are in significant trouble when it comes to social justice and civil rights in this country. I've done the easy part. Now the hard part. Is there any hope for the future? This will come as an absolute shock within my own family, where I am known as the reincarnation of Eeyore, that if things are bad today, wait until tomorrow and see how much worse they are. But in this case, I sit before you this morning as someone who is actually optimistic about the future. When I say that, I don't mean tomorrow, but within certainly the next decade, I see some real chance for a return to progress in civil rights and civil liberties for three reasons, and the reasons are interconnected. I have for, 70 years almost, been a member and participant in a number of civil rights organizations and civil liberties organizations. And I followed their discourse very carefully through those years. And what I'm noticing now is a subtle yet significant change in their messaging. Rather than talking about individual issues, they really are talking more globally about overriding attitudes and how we can affect those and how we can bring about change. Because when you think about it, we have a significant portion of the population, maybe as much as 40%, of people who are voting against their own self-interest. They're voting for candidates and for positions that if they really looked at them closely, none of that's going to happen. It's not going to help them, it's going to hurt them. And that gives the organizations that are committed to social justice and civil rights an opening. It's a way to talk to those folks and to actually begin to change their underlying attitudes. Secondly, and this is one of the few positives I see in the Trump years, we can now, because he enabled and empowered the discontented, we can see who they are. And we have a chance now to move beyond their rhetoric to the source of their pain and try to find a way to address that. And once again, I see social justice organizations moving in that direction. Won't happen tomorrow, but there's the potential for real change down the road. And finally, I am absolutely convinced that the spirit of Charles Hamilton Houston is alive and well. I see it every day in the life of this church and what you're doing to promote social justice in this country. So I hope that you'll draw strength and power from the words that Paul so beautifully read to you just a moment ago. I believe with all my heart In Dr. King's words, I believe that unarmed truth, unconditional love, will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant. I invite you now to own reflection upon these words.